Cowboy was given a Cheyenne girl as a cruel joke, but what she said next made his blood run hot. Jake Foster was a cowboy through and through, hardened by years of work on the sprawling ranches of the American West. He had seen it all: cattle drives, wild storms, and even run-ins with outlaw gangs. There was no challenge too big, no person too tough for Jake to handle. His reputation was built on his skill with horses, his calm in a fight, and the way he handled tough situations without breaking a sweat. One sunny afternoon, Jake found himself at the center of a cruel prank, one that would change his life forever. It started when he and a group of cowboys gathered at the local saloon. They had spent the morning fixing fences and tending to cattle. The mood was light, and the air was filled with the smell of dust and whiskey. As the men relaxed around a fire, laughing and joking about their work, one of the younger cowboys, Tom, came up with an idea. "Let's have some fun with Jake," Tom said, a mischievous gleam in his eyes. The others paused, intrigued. Tom was always the troublemaker, the one who liked to stir things up. But this time, his plan was something different.
He had recently heard about a raid on a Cheyenne village up north, and the men had taken some of the women captive.
In the twisted mind of Tom and his friends, the idea of giving Jake one of these women as a joke seemed like the perfect way to get some laughs.
They knew Jake's reputation as a loner, someone who didn't care much for socializing, and they figured this would push him out of his comfort zone. "Hey, Jake!" Tom called, his voice filled with amusement. "We've got a little surprise for you." Jake raised an eyebrow and turned to face the group. He had a good feeling about what was coming, but didn't want to make a scene. Tom's grin was wide, and that usually meant trouble. Without another word, Tom gestured for one of the men to bring the woman forward. Jake's eyes narrowed as he saw her, standing quietly, her head held high, her eyes scanning the group. Both someone much older than 20, with long black hair and the proud face of someone who had known hardship. She was dressed in the rough clothing of someone used to traveling on horseback, her skin sun-kissed from days spent under the open sky. "Meet your new companion," Tom said with a chuckle, his voice laced with mockery. Jake's heart sank as he realized what they were doing. They were offering him this Cheyenne girl as a joke. The men around him laughed, thinking it was the funniest thing they'd ever seen. But Jake wasn't amused. He looked at the woman, whose expression was unreadable, and then back at the men. He didn't like what was happening, but he knew better than to show weakness in front of the others. For a moment, there was an uncomfortable silence. The fire crackled, the sound of horses stomping in the distance, the only thing breaking the tension. Jake forced himself to speak, though the words felt thick in his mouth. "She's not a joke," he muttered, his voice low. But Tom and the others weren't listening. They were too caught up in their own amusement to care about Jake's discomfort. They'd expected him to laugh, to go along with it. But Jake wasn't like that. He had always been different from the other cowboys. He kept to himself, worked hard, and avoided unnecessary trouble. Now, here he was, caught in the middle of something he didn't want any part of. The Cheyenne girl stood still, her posture stiff, her gaze never wavering. It was as though she had already resigned herself to whatever fate had in store for her. She wasn't scared. She wasn't begging for help. She just watched, her dark eyes full of something that Jake couldn't place. Defiance? Strength? Or maybe both. Desk. Tom, noticing the lack of response from Jake, laughed harder. "Well, you're not going to say no, are you?" he teased, nudging one of the other cowboys who smirked back. Jake clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He didn't like the way they were treating her. He didn't like how they treated women like property, like something to be passed around for fun. It was one thing for them to joke around with each other, but this felt different. This was something that went against everything he believed in. For a brief moment, Jake felt something stir inside him. He couldn't explain it, but it was there, an urge to stand up to protect this woman, even if she was a stranger, even if the men around him didn't think it mattered. He didn't know her story, didn't know what she had been through, but something in her quiet strength spoke to him. Breath. He had seen plenty of women out here, some tough, some gentle. But this girl, this woman, was different. She wasn't just a captive. She wasn't a prize to be won. She was a person. "You can take her back," Jake said, his voice stronger now, though still low enough that only the men nearby could hear. Tom paused, his grin faltering as he saw the look on Jake's face. Breath. "What?" he asked, disbelief in his voice. "You don't want her?" Jake shook his head, his anger starting to rise. "She's not a thing for you to give away," he said firmly. The other men exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. This wasn't the reaction they had been expecting. They had all assumed Jake would laugh along, maybe even take her for himself as part of the joke. But this wasn't funny to him. This wasn't a game. To Jake, this was personal. The Cheyenne girl remained silent through it all, her eyes still locked on Jake. There was no fear in her gaze, no pleading, but something in her posture told him she was waiting for him to make a decision. And in that moment, Jake realized that the way he handled this would set the tone for everything that came after. He could either follow along with the cruel joke and remain part of the group, or he could stand apart, show the men that there were things worth fighting for. With a deep breath, Jake stood tall and turned to the girl. "You're free to go," he said softly, but with authority. "Des. I'm not part of this." The laughter stopped, and a heavy silence fell over the camp. Jake could feel the men's eyes on him, but he didn't care. He had made his choice. The girl, still silent, looked at him for a long moment before she finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear.
"Thank you," she said. The words simple, but they carried a weight that Jake couldn't ignore. The others didn't know what to make of it.
But for Jake, it was the start of something that he couldn't have predicted, something that would change him in ways he couldn't yet understand. Jake watched as the Cheyenne girl, who had yet to give her name, stood in front of him. She didn't run away. She didn't beg for freedom. Her gaze was steady, almost defiant, as if she had already accepted that whatever was coming next, she would face it without fear. The men around the campfire remained silent, unsure of what to say or do after Jake's unexpected words. They had expected the usual response from him, laughter or indifference, but Jake had done the unexpected. And now, the tension hung in the air like a thick fog. Jake's mind was racing. The Cheyenne girl's words, "Thank you," kept echoing in his head. They weren't the words of someone who felt weak, someone who had given up. No, she had said them with a quiet strength that made Jake feel something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was a feeling of respect. He didn't know why, but he knew he couldn't just let things go back to normal, the way the other cowboys treated her, as though she were a joke, an object to be passed around. It sat wrong with him.
He'd been raised to believe in fairness, to respect people no matter where they came from.
But these men, his so-called friends, they didn't see it that way. They saw everything as a game, something to laugh at or use for their own amusement. They had no idea what it meant to be a person, to have dignity, to be more than just a part of their twisted world. The girl still hadn't moved, still hadn't said a word beyond her quiet thanks. Jake couldn't help but notice how still she stood, like a tree in the wind. There was strength in her, even though she didn't speak much. You wondered what had brought her here. Who was she? What had she been through? What kind of life had she led before the men brought her to this camp? Tom, the young cowboy who had come up with the joke in the first place, finally broke the silence. He stood up from his spot by the fire, dusting his hands off as if the conversation was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Well, look at that, Jake," he said with a smirk. "You actually turned down a free woman." "What's the matter? Don't like your prize?" Jake didn't take the bait. He wasn't about to play along with Tom's game. "Not anymore. She's not a prize," Jake said firmly. "Earth." His voice was steady, unshaken. "You don't get to treat people like that." Tom's grin faded slightly, and he glanced over at the others. The other men were watching the exchange, some of them unsure how to react, others just looking for a reason to laugh. But no one laughed. No one spoke. Jake felt their eyes on him, and he didn't care. They were no longer in control of this situation. He was. The girl stood there, still as ever, but Jake could see something shift in her eyes. She was watching him more closely now, as if assessing him, trying to understand what kind of man he was. He wasn't sure why, but he didn't want to disappoint her. He had a feeling she had been let down by too many people already, and he didn't want to be another one. Jake stepped closer to her, trying to keep his voice calm.
"What's your name?" he asked softly.
She looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with something Jake couldn't quite read. For a moment, it felt as if she were deciding whether or not to trust him. Then, finally, she spoke. "Lily," she said quietly, the word almost like a whisper in the night air. "My name is Lily." "Lily," Jake repeated, the name feeling strange on his tongue. It was a simple name, but somehow it seemed to carry weight. She wasn't just some captive. She wasn't a joke. She was a person, a woman with a past and a story that had yet to be told. "Why are you here?" Jake asked, unable to hold back the question any longer. Lily's eyes flickered to the men around the campfire, and Jake saw a brief flash of something dark in her expression. Pain? Anger? He wasn't sure. But whatever it was enough to make him pause. She didn't speak for a long while, and just when Jake thought she wasn't going to answer, she finally did. "My people were taken," she said, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "The raid was not our doing. We were just living our lives when they came for us."
Jake's heart sank.
He had heard of such raids before, but hearing it from her, from someone who had lived through it, made it feel all too real. It made him feel small, helpless in the face of her strength. "I'm sorry," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know." Lily didn't respond to his apology. Perhaps. Instead, she turned away from him slightly, staring out into the darkness beyond the campfire.
"You can't understand," she said, her words like a sharp edge cutting through the night air.
"But you don't have to! You don't have to do anything for me!" Bet. Jake stood there, watching her, unsure of what to say. He had expected a different reaction, maybe anger or frustration, but not this cold distance. It made him feel as if he were the outsider, as if she were pushing him away for a reason he couldn't yet grasp. He had no answer to give, Brett. He couldn't pretend to understand what she had been through, what her people had lost. But there was one thing Jake knew for sure. He wouldn't be like the others, bruh. He wouldn't treat her as a joke, as something to mock or control. She deserved better than that. For the rest of the evening, there was little conversation. The other cowboys seemed to retreat into their own thoughts, each one unsure of how to react to the change in the air. Tom tried to make a few more jokes, but they fell flat. No one was laughing anymore. As the night wore on, Jake found himself sitting by the fire, lost in thought. He couldn't stop thinking about Lily, about what she had said, about how she had looked at him. It had been so different from anything he had ever experienced.
She was strong, independent, and yet there was something fragile about her, too.
Something that made him want to protect her, even though he barely knew her. Lily remained near the edge of the camp, sitting by herself, her back straight and her gaze far off in the distance. Jake wondered if she was thinking about her home, about the family she had lost. He wondered what her life had been like before everything had been torn apart. But whatever it was, Jake knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just walk away from this. He couldn't ignore what he had seen, what he had felt. He didn't know where this would lead, but he knew it would be something different, something important. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt a stirring of hope. Days passed, and the camp became quieter. The usual banter around the fire had faded, replaced by a strange tension that hung in the air like an unwanted guest. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something important was happening, something he didn't fully understand yet, but he could feel it deep in his bones. The other cowboys, still unsure of what to make of Jake's actions, had started to keep their distance. They no longer teased him about Lily, but they also didn't offer him any support. It was as if they were waiting for him to break, to give in to the pressure of being the odd one out. They didn't understand why he'd decided to protect her, to treat her with respect, instead of playing along with their cruel joke. Jake, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about Lily. He couldn't help but notice the way she carried herself, how she never let her head droop, how she always stood tall no matter what was thrown her way. It was as if she had a quiet strength that Jake had never seen in anyone before. But there was something else, too. Something more hidden beneath her calm exterior. Whenever she spoke, there was a trace of sadness in her voice, as if the weight of her past was always with her, just out of reach. He had tried to talk to her a few times, but she was always distant, always reluctant to share too much.
It was as though she had learned to guard herself from others, to keep everything inside. She didn't trust anyone easily, and who could blame her?
Her world had been turned upside down in an instant. One moment, she had been with her people, living her life in the only way she knew how.
The next moment, everything was taken from her, and she found herself trapped among strangers who treated her like an object. Still, Jake didn't give up. Every evening, after the work was done and the others had retreated to their own corners of the camp, Jake would sit near Lily, watching the firelight flicker in her dark eyes. He didn't speak much, but every now and then she would glance over at him, and he would catch the faintest glimpse of something in her eyes, a flicker of curiosity, or maybe just the smallest amount of hope. One evening, after the work was done and the men were busy talking among themselves, Jake walked over to where Lily sat by the fire. The others were laughing, completely unaware of what was happening just a few yards away. Desk. Jake didn't mind. This was between him and her. "Hey, Lily," he said, his voice soft but steady. Lily didn't look up at him at first. Desk. She just continued to stare into the fire, her face illuminated by the flickering light. Jake sat down next to her, careful not to make any sudden movements. He didn't want to startle her. After a moment, she finally spoke. Breath.
You don't have to keep coming over here,
she said, her voice low and quiet, almost hesitant. Jake's heart sank a little. He had hoped that maybe, just maybe, she was starting to trust him. But her words felt like a wall being built between them. He understood, though. She had been through too much to open up easily. Trust wasn't something you gave away freely when you'd been hurt. "I just want to talk," Jake said, trying to keep his tone light. "I don't want you to feel alone." Lily's eyes flickered toward him, and for a moment their gazes met. There was something in her expression, something unreadable, that made Jake's heart race. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something more complicated. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he felt it deep inside. "Bro, I'm not alone," she replied, though her voice didn't sound entirely convincing. Jake nodded, his eyes still on her face. "You've been through a lot," he said gently. "I can't pretend to know what it's like, but I do know that you don't have to go through this by yourself." Lily was silent for a long time, her gaze returning to the fire. Jake watched her, giving her the space she needed. He wasn't going to push her. Burst. He had learned that much by now, but he wanted her to know that he was here, that he wasn't going anywhere. "You don't understand," Lily said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one understands." Jake was quiet for a moment, letting her words sink in. "Maybe not," he said softly. "But I'm still here." She looked at him again, this time with more intensity. For the first time, Jake saw a crack in her armor. It was brief, but it was there. He could see the weight of her past in her eyes, and it made him ache for her. She was strong, yes, but she was also broken in ways that no one could fix with a simple, kind word. The scars she carried went deeper than Jake could ever know. Lily turned away from him, her jaw tightening. "Dumb."
"You should go," she said, her voice colder now. "I don't need your pity." Jake's chest tightened, but he didn't stand up.
He wasn't going to leave. Not yet. "I'm not here out of pity," he said, his voice firm but kind. "I'm here because I want to help." "Because you deserve better than this." Lily turned back to him then, her eyes narrowing. Breath. She didn't speak right away, but the look in her eyes said everything. It was a challenge, a question. Do you really want to help, or are you just trying to feel good about yourself? Breath. Jake felt the weight of that look, and for the first time, he understood.
He wasn't here to be her savior.
He wasn't here to make himself feel better by helping her. He was here because he genuinely cared. He didn't know why, but he did. "I don't want to be your savior, Lily," Jake said quietly, his voice softening. "I just want to be here for you. I can't undo what's happened, but maybe I can help you find a way out of this." But she didn't say anything at first. But for the first time, Jake saw a flicker of something in her eyes. It was a glimmer of hope, tiny and fragile, but it was there.
Lily didn't respond right away, but as the night went on, Jake noticed something different in her.
She wasn't as distant as before. She wasn't pulling away. And though she didn't speak of it, Jake felt a shift in her, a small crack in the wall she had built around herself. For the first time since the night they met, Jake felt like maybe, just maybe, he was getting through to her. The days that followed seemed to stretch on endlessly, but Jake couldn't ignore the feeling that something was changing. Lily, though still guarded, had started to show small signs that she was letting him in. It wasn't much, just a brief look when their eyes met, or a softening in her voice when she spoke, but to Jake, it was enough. It was enough to keep him coming back, enough to make him believe that, despite everything, there was a chance for something better between them. Jake continued to make an effort. Every evening after the work was done, he would find a quiet spot near the fire and sit down next to Lily. He didn't force her to talk, and he didn't try to pry into her past. He simply sat with her, offering his presence, offering his company. In return, she started to open up just a little bit more each day. One evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon and the stars began to twinkle overhead, Jake and Lily sat side by the fire. The other men were spread out around the camp, talking and laughing, but Jake and Lily remained in their corner, quietly watching the flames. Lily had begun to speak more. At first it had been just bits and pieces, fragments of stories, memories of her childhood, snippets of her life before the raid. But tonight, there was something different in the air. There was a sense of trust that had begun to grow between them. Something unspoken, but felt. Jake could sense it, and for the first time he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could both heal from the past. "I had a family," Lily said, her voice soft as she stared into the fire. "We were happy. My father was a strong man, a leader. We lived in a small village by the river. I remember the sound of the water at night. It was peaceful." She paused as if lost in thought, before continuing. "My mother, she was gentle. She loved the land, the trees, the animals. She taught me everything I know about the earth. I remember the way the sun felt on my face when we would walk through the fields. I felt safe back then." Jake listened quietly, his eyes focused on her as she spoke. He could hear the sorrow in her voice, the deep sadness of someone who had lost everything. He didn't say anything at first, letting her speak at her own pace. He wanted her to feel comfortable, to know that she didn't have to hide her memories from him. And then Lily's voice faltered, and she stopped herself. Her fingers clenched around the small rock she was holding, and Jake could see the way her jaw tightened. And then they came. "The soldiers. They took everything from us. My family. My home. They didn't care who we were, what we had. All they wanted was to destroy us." Jake could feel the weight of her words, and he knew that there was more to her story than she was letting on. But he also knew that this was a step, however small, in the right direction. She was sharing something with him. Something that had been buried deep inside her for so long. "I'm sorry," Jake said quietly, his voice full of sympathy. "I wish I could have done something to stop it."
Lily didn't respond at first.
Instead, she stared at the fire, her eyes distant. "It's not your fault," she said after a long pause. "No one could have stopped them. Not even my father. He fought as hard as he could, but in the end, they were too strong. They took us by surprise, and we were too outnumbered. It was over before we even realized it." Jake didn't know what to say to that. What could he say? He couldn't undo the past. He couldn't bring her family back or fix what had been broken. But he could be here, right now, offering her a chance at something different, a chance at a life that wasn't defined by loss and pain. "You're strong," Jake said finally, his voice steady. "You survived."
We're still here." Lily gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile, but it was enough to make Jake's heart skip a beat. "Surviving doesn't mean it's over," she said softly.
"But it just means you keep going, even when you don't know where you're headed." Jake nodded, understanding her words in a way he hadn't before. He had always prided himself on his ability to survive, to get through tough situations, but surviving wasn't living. And Lily, despite everything she had been through, was still searching for something more. Something real. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They simply sat in silence, watching the fire burn low and the stars fill the sky above them. The warmth from the flames seemed to seep into Jake's bones, but it was the quiet companionship that filled the emptiness in his chest. It was a feeling he hadn't known he was missing. As the fire slowly died down, the camp around them settled into a peaceful quiet. Jake stood up, stretching his stiff legs. "It's getting late," he said, glancing at the darkened sky, "but we should probably get some rest." Lily nodded, standing as well. She didn't say anything, but there was a shift in her posture, something that felt lighter than before. Jake didn't know what it meant, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was changing between them. Something that was more than just friendship. More than just two people passing the time in a camp. "Good night, Lily," Jake said, his voice gentle. "Good night, Jake," she replied, her words soft but warm. And for the first time, Jake felt like the distance between them had shrunk just a little bit more. Maybe tomorrow would bring more of the same. Quiet moments, shared stories, and slow steps toward understanding. But for now, he was content to leave things as they were, breaths. The days began to blend together in the quiet of the camp. The work was hard, and the nights were long, but for Jake it had become a routine he could manage. The other cowboys still mocked him now and then, throwing jabs about his softness toward Lily, but Jake didn't care anymore. He had learned to ignore their words, to focus on the one person who truly mattered, the woman who had come into his life like a storm, leaving a trail of questions and emotions in her wake. Grasp. Lily, too, seemed to have settled into the rhythm of the camp, though it was clear she was still struggling with her memories. The shadow of her past was never far from her, and Jake noticed how she would sometimes lose herself in her thoughts, staring off into the distance as if searching for something she could no longer find. But even in her moments of silence, there was a strength in her, a quiet resilience that Jake couldn't help but admire. It had been over a week since they had first shared that evening by the fire, and Jake found himself thinking about her more and more. The walls she had built around herself were starting to crumble, bit by bit. She would talk to him now, not just about the past, but about small things. Things that made her smile. Her favorite places as a child. The songs her mother used to sing. The way the wind felt when it blew through the trees in her homeland. These little pieces of her past were like treasures to Jake. Breaths. They gave him glimpses into her heart. Into the woman she had once been before the world had changed her forever. One evening as the sun began to set, Jake found Lily sitting by the edge of the camp, looking out at the vast horizon. The others were busy around the fire, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was different. There was something in the air, something that made him want to reach out, to take a step forward.
He walked over to where Lily sat, her back straight, her face unreadable.
She didn't notice him at first, and he hesitated, unsure if he should disturb her. But then, just as he was about to turn away, she looked up, and their eyes met.
"Hey," Jake said softly, sitting down next to her. "Mind if I join you?"
Lily gave him a small nod, her lips curving into a slight, almost imperceptible smile.
"It's been a long day," she said, her voice tired but calm. "I needed some air." Jake nodded, glancing at the horizon where the sky was turning shades of pink and orange. "I get it," he replied. "Sometimes it's nice to just be
quiet. No distractions." They sat in silence for a while, watching as the sun dipped lower and lower, painting the sky with warm colors. For the first time, it didn't feel awkward. It didn't feel like there were walls between them. It felt right.
"You know," Lily said after a while, her voice softer than before, "I used to dream of being free. Not just from the soldiers who took my people, but from everything."
From the weight of all this. "Eee!" She motioned to the land around them, the camp, the fire, everything. I wanted to run, to find a place where I could just be, where I wasn't always thinking about what happened. Jake didn't know what to say to that.
But
He understood the feeling, though. The need to escape, to leave behind the things that weighed you down.
But he also knew that you couldn't run forever. At some point, you had to face what you'd been through.
You had to find a way to move forward. I get that, Jake said quietly.
Sometimes I wish I could leave all this behind, too. But I've learned something.
I've learned that sometimes you don't have to run. You just need to find the right people. People who see you, who understand.
Lily turned her head to look at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand the meaning behind his words. "And you think you understand me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake met her gaze, and for the first time, he didn't look away. "Breaths, not fully," he said, his voice steady but gentle. "But I know what it's like to carry a weight you can't share. To feel like you're not really living, just surviving."
He paused, letting the words sink in. "I don't know everything about you, Lily."
But I want to. I want to be someone you can count on. Not just for today, but for whatever comes next. Lily's eyes softened, and Jake saw something in them that he hadn't seen before. Trust. Not the kind of trust you gave away easily, but the kind that was earned over time. The kind that came from shared experiences, from small moments of connection. It was a fragile thing, but it was there, and it made Jake's heart race.
"I don't know what comes next either," Lily said after a long pause, her voice quiet.
"But for the first time in a long time, I don't feel so alone."
Jake felt a warmth spread through him, a feeling of hope he hadn't expected. Maybe they couldn't change the past, but they could shape their future.
"Together. I'm glad," Jake said, his voice soft.
"You don't have to be alone, Lily. Not anymore."
They sat there for a long time, watching the stars begin to appear in the sky. The night was quiet, the world around them still, but inside, Jake felt a shift. He had started this journey not knowing where it would lead, not knowing what would come of the time he spent with Lily. But now, as he sat beside her, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. They weren't the same people they had been when they first met. They had both changed, had both opened up in ways they hadn't expected.
And whatever came next, Jake knew they would face it together. The fire crackled behind them, casting long shadows in the night.
But Jake didn't know what the future held. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. And as he turned to look at Lily, he knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened, he wasn't going anywhere. He wasn't going to let her face the world alone. Not again.